The Hayfield Siege, how 27th Infantry survived Sioux-Cheyenne onslaught. A deafening roar filled the air as hundreds of warriors thundered down the hills. Incoming, someone screamed. The sky turned black, not from clouds, but from a storm of arrows. Spears slammed into the ground. Hooves pounded the earth like rolling thunder. 30 men, 800 warriors. Death was inevitable. Or so it seemed. What happened next defied all logic. This wasn't another massacre. It became one of the most unbelievable battles of the Indian Wars. Stay with us and uncover the truth. Subscribe to Histories and Native Tales now. In late July 1867, the sweltering heat of Montana enveloped a large buffalo hide lodge, where Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors and chiefs gathered in sacred ceremony. The rhythmic pounding of a massive war drum echoed through the air as they chanted battle songs with waning but determined energy after hours of ritual. Dozens of warriors crowded the already stifling lodge, their bodies adding to the oppressive heat. Smoke and sweat permeated the air. At the center, several young warriors circled slowly, their chests pierced on both sides by thick leather thongs. They were utterly exhausted after hours of dancing, chanting, and blood loss. Occasionally, these warriors would suspend their entire body weight from the thongs, stretching every sinew to its absolute limit in pursuit of divine favor. To an uninformed outsider, this strange, even disturbing scene might have appeared like a bizarre spectacle, but for the assembled warriors, it represented a profound spiritual endeavor, crucial to their people's fate. "The white man's armies grow stronger, while our lands shrink," muttered an elder warrior, his voice barely audible above the drumming. "We must have guidance from the Great Spirit." Their purpose was to seek the favor of the Great Spirit and glimpse the deity's intentions through visions induced by fasting, dancing, chanting, or a combination of these practices. Though their wounds were typically superficial, the sight and smell of blood created an almost overwhelming atmosphere. The ceremony was deliberately horrific, because these nations understood that war itself was horrific. With the white man's Great War in the East apparently over, the Bluecoats were again invading territories they had sworn to avoid 15 years earlier. Despite the U.S. government agreeing to terms with the tribes in the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, the post-Civil War westward expansion demanded increasingly frequent incursions into lands legally not theirs. "They make promises with one hand and break them with the other," said a Cheyenne warrior with battle scars across his chest. "Their words are like smoke in the wind." A year earlier, the legendary Sioux chief Red Cloud had launched a campaign with tactical and strategic brilliance against the U.S. Army, attempting to halt both settler escorts and the military occupation of forts built across the plains. On December 21, 1866, though absent from battle due to wounds sustained in a raid against their hated Crow enemies, Red Cloud's forces had annihilated a large American cavalry detachment under Captain William J. Fetterman's command. This defeat represented the U.S. Army's worst loss on the plains until the Battle of Little Bighorn, a decade later. A force of approximately 1,000 warriors, including future legends like Crazy Horse and American Horse, slaughtered every member of the 81-man patrol in a bloody and desperate hand-to-hand battle. Following Northern Plains warfare customs, both as deterrent and punishment, the bodies of the slain were horrifically mutilated and left for their comrades. Colonel Henry B. Carrington, the fort's commanding officer during the Fetterman Massacre, led a cavalry detachment to recover the fallen the day after the battle. Carrington's description of what he and his men found epitomized the aftermath of countless encounters between the U.S. Army and native tribes across the vast plains. "We found their eyes torn out and placed on rocks, noses cut off, ears cut off, chins hewn off, teeth chopped out, joints of their fingers cut off, brains taken out and placed on rocks with other members of the body. Carrington reported, his voice breaking as he dictated his findings. Private parts severed and indecently placed on the person. Such deeply disturbing scenes would forever haunt the dreams of those present that day, who endured the horrific task of burying their brutally mutilated comrades in the frozen Wyoming frontier soil. An heroic journey was undertaken by Manuel Felipe Cardu, also known as John Phillips or Pugy Phillips, through blizzard conditions from Fort Phil Kearny to Fort Laramie, where Colonel Innes Palmer was informed of the defeat and reinforcements mobilized. Though the Army avoided such tragic losses throughout spring and much of summer, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho continued harassing travelers on the Bozeman Trail, and civilian parties gathering timber and hay activities serving as crucial lifelines for the forts. Now, as the summer hunting and war season reached its peak, the tribes assembled for the Sundance. On the scorching Montana, plains intended to divine their next target with help from both the Great Spirit and the war chiefs who had led them so brilliantly in previous months. The white men's forts stand on our hunting grounds like festering wounds, Red Cloud told his assembled warriors, his voice carrying across the ceremonial grounds. We must cut them off from what keeps them alive. Red Cloud had decided their next targets would be the civilian work parties from Fort C.F., Smith, and Fort Phil Kearny. Following classic guerrilla warfare strategy, he had no intention of attacking the fortified strongholds of the forts, but would instead strike at their most vulnerable elements when and where they presented themselves as targets. It was determined that within just weeks, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors currently gathered for the Sundance would continue terrorizing U.S. Army forts, and they would not stop until the United States Army and all white men vanished from their territory forever. What none of them could have anticipated was that their next encounter would become one of the most remarkable battles in the history of the Indian Wars, a fight where 30 men would face down 800 warriors and somehow live to tell the tale. On the morning of August 1867, warriors rose hours before dawn to complete their pre-raid rituals. The camp buzzed with quiet, purposeful activity in the darkness. Men painted their horses with symbols of protection and power, while adorning their own bodies with marks of courage and spiritual significance. Today, we will drive them from our lands, a Cheyenne warrior told his companions as he checked his bow and arrows for the third time. Weapons were meticulously inspected, bows tested for tension, arrows examined for straightness, and rifles cleaned and loaded. Prayers rose to the morning sky as warriors drank water, nearly to the point of nausea, preparing their bodies for the long, hot day of battle ahead. Miles away, as dawn began to break, soldiers, civilians, and scouts within the walls of Fort C.F. Smith readied themselves for another day of hard labor in the unremitting summer heat. The fort, one of 3 established along the Bozeman Trail, stood as an unwelcome intrusion in native territory, a constant reminder of broken promises. The inhabitants hurriedly consumed breakfasts of hardtack and black coffee, nervously eyeing the rolling countryside outside the fort's walls in the hue of the new dawn glow. Private Thomas Williams glanced toward the distant hills as he chewed his tasteless breakfast. Something doesn't feel right today, he muttered to his companion. The scene was sparse, beautiful, and deceptively placid. The golden morning light cast long shadows across the prairie grasses that swayed gently in the early breeze. But as the men made small talk and finished their breakfasts, every one of them knew that very real danger lurked somewhere out there on the open plains. However, the option to simply hunker down inside the walls of the fort, enticing as it might seem, was not tenable. Without the civilian laborers venturing forth to cut and gather hay that sustained the livestock within the fort, their means of both sustenance and mobility would be markedly compromised. So just after sunrise, a group of 30 men composed of 21 soldiers and 9 civilians began their nerve-rattling 2.5-mile commute to the Hayfield in the Bighorn Valley, where their day's work of harvesting awaited. The wagon wheels creaked, and the mules snorted as they made their way across the open terrain, each man scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. "Keep your eyes open and your rifles close," Lieutenant Sigmund Sternberg instructed as they approached the hayfield. "We've had reports of increased activity in the area." As the laborers set about their work, the soldiers took their guard positions. The soldiers, members of the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry, under Lieutenant Sternberg's command, split their force of 21 men between the hilltops surrounding the hayfield and the improvised corral-turned-fort that would serve as shelter should an attack occur. The fort, more aptly described by one source as a fortified corral, had been constructed on the left bank of Warman Creek, roughly 40 feet from the spring bed. It measured approximately 100 feet by 60 feet and consisted of upright posts sunk into the ground at 6-foot intervals. Horizontally attached to these were heavy poles, tied off to the vertical poles and interlaced with green willow branches. At best, under actual duress, the fortification would provide little cover, but it was certainly better than being caught in the open. Though undeniably unnerved by the austerity and peril of their current location, the haycutters were motivated by the oppressive heat of the day that would soon become their second most formidable enemy. Thus, they made a concerted effort to cut as much of the waist-high grass as possible, using mule-drawn hay mowers that had become popular in the last few decades. "We'll need to work fast today," called out one of the civilian contractors, wiping sweat from his brow. "This heat's only going to get worse." Suddenly, the plodding of the mules, the calls of the drivers, and the spinning of the cutting blades were drowned out by the sound of gunfire and the cries of the guards stationed on the hilltops. "Indians! Hundreds of them!" shouted a soldier as he raced down from his observation point, his face pale with fear. "Get to the corral." As the soldiers called out to their cohorts in the fort and frantically made their way to the confines of the ad hoc structure, the laborers in the field couldn't fully discern what they were saying, but the meaning behind their actions was instantly all too clear. Native warriors had been spotted, and presumably in large numbers, given the panic of the rapidly retreating soldiers. Now every one of them was in very real danger. The men in the field abandoned their harvesting tools and sprinted toward the wooden-walled fort. As they ran, they glanced repeatedly over their shoulders at a sight more terrifying than they had initially imagined. Between 500 and 800 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors flooding over the ridges of the surrounding hilltops. The sheer number of warriors, appearing simultaneously, created a vision of overwhelming force that struck fear into even the most experienced frontiersmen among them. It was a veritable torrent of humanity and horseflesh as the warriors rumbled toward them. Their bright war paint, feathers, gleaming weapons, and piercing cries presented a sight that had haunted virtually all of the Americans' nightmares for weeks. They had time and again heard the bone-chilling accounts of those soldiers who had found the unfortunate remains of the dead at the site of the Fetterman Massacre, and had, to a man, often wondered if they might suffer the same fate themselves. But now, the spectacle before them presented a very immediate and very mortal threat. Before many of the Americans, both soldiers and civilians, could join their comrades already defending the fort, the warriors were closing in, their war cries filling the air with a sound that seemed to freeze the blood in their veins. The Hayfield Fight was about to begin, and the odds seemed insurmountable. Before many soldiers and civilians could reach the safety of the corral, several Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors outflanked them from across the hayfield. Some warriors even seized rifle pits that had been dug just outside the hastily constructed walls of the fortification. From behind these makeshift walls, the defenders fought ferociously, firing their first volley from new model 1866 Springfield breech-loading rifles. These weapons represented a revolutionary advancement in military technology, allowing soldiers to fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute 5 to 6 times faster than their previous armaments. The native warriors had no knowledge of this tactical advantage. Their strategy, as the attacking force, followed a pattern that had served them well in previous engagements: absorb the first volley, accept some initial casualties, then ultimately isolate and overwhelm the intruders, just as they had done with Captain Fetterman's command in earlier confrontations. The sustained defensive fire from the Americans split the native attack into two separate directions, with one group approaching from the west and the remainder from the east. A fierce battle erupted as warriors charged forward, sending volleys of arrows into the fortified corral, while their war cries nearly drowned out the thunderous reports of the Springfield rifles. Lieutenant Sternberg maintained his position, standing upright among his prone soldiers, urging them to hold position and make every shot count in the face of the overwhelming assault. The first minutes of the battle unfolded rapidly in chaos and confusion. Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho war chiefs urged on younger warriors, while Lieutenant Sternberg resolutely maintained his position. Standing above his prone soldiers, he calmly encouraged and directed their fire. Sternberg, a veteran of several engagements, refused to take cover and fired his pistol while fully exposed to enemy fire. This action was undoubtedly brave, but profoundly unwise in plains warfare. Within minutes, the 30-year-old lieutenant fell with a bullet to the head from one of the attacking warriors. When Lieutenant Sternberg fell to enemy fire, the situation deteriorated rapidly with the loss of their official commander. A civilian named Colvin immediately stepped forward to take charge of the defense. Unlike the lieutenant, Colvin recognized the danger of exposing oneself to enemy fire and instructed the soldiers to keep firing from whatever cover they could find. This practical leadership likely saved many lives as the battle continued. Another soldier, a private named Nairon, was also shot and killed by the attacking warriors. Eventually, the initial assault was repelled, and the main force of warriors withdrew to regroup and reorganize. Several individual warriors, however, took positions among the willows by the creek, from which they continuously sniped at the soldiers throughout the morning and into the afternoon. Both sides exchanged largely ineffective fire, but the situation made any retreat to Fort C.F. Smith virtually impossible. As the day wore on, anxiety mounted among both soldiers and civilians trapped inside the Hayfield Fort. For reasons never clearly explained in military records, no relief force had been dispatched from Fort C.F. Smith to aid their embattled comrades. The men exchanged worried glances as they reloaded their weapons, the unspoken fear of death hanging heavy in the air. Many believed they would die on this barren hayfield, far from home. Others worried about suffering a fate similar to Fetterman's men, the previous winter captured and subjected to torture before death. The specter of the Fetterman Massacre haunted every man present, creating a desperate determination to avoid capture at all costs. Meanwhile, though they had killed the enemy commander, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had themselves suffered numerous casualties in the initial attack. All were astonished by the capabilities of the soldiers' new rapid-firing weapons. Their guns shoot without stopping. One warrior told his chief during the lull, "It is like fighting against many more men than we can see." The decision was made that if warriors couldn't dislodge the soldiers from their defensive works with a direct assault, they would burn the wooden fortifications and rush in through the smoke. Soon after, soldiers lying flat behind the scant cover provided by the wooden fence and woven branches realized their brief respite had ended as dozens of fire arrows rained down on the dry grass surrounding the fort. Hidden behind smoke and flames, Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors made daring charges to rescue fallen comrades and retrieve their bodies. Private Lockhart, a young soldier defending the fort, later recounted, The fire rolled toward us like ocean waves, with the Indians whooping behind it. When it reached about 20 feet from our fence, it stopped as if halted by some supernatural force. The flame shot straight up at least 40 feet high, wavered once or twice, then went out like a slap. Immediately after, the wind blew the smoke from the smoldering grass away from our miraculously saved camp. Following an initial charge to retrieve comrades, the native warriors launched another fierce attack on the fort itself, showering the defenders with bullets and arrows, while suffering considerable casualties themselves. In this assault, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho inflicted a mortal wound on J.G. Hollister and wounded Sergeant Norton. The battle again transformed into a sniping duel, with each side reluctant to make any major moves. As the summer sun reached its scorching zenith at midday, both sides were exhausted from heat and combat intensity. A temporary ceasefire occurred, each side seizing the opportunity to gather water and tend to their wounded, while awaiting another attack that would almost certainly come soon. The soldiers and civilians sheltering inside the Hayfield Fort deepened their positions, and each man ensured he had adequate water and ammunition. A deafening roar filled the air as hundreds of warriors thundered down the hills. "Save some for later," he advised. "This fight is far from over." Soon enough, another attack came. The bone-chilling war cries of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho ringing out as brave warriors mounted another assault, hoping to finally overrun the Hayfield Fort. But this time, the defenders, with more fortified positions and collective morale boosted by replenished water supplies, offered their strongest resistance. Yet, their repeating rifles again inflicted significant damage on the attacking warriors. Their first assault after the ceasefire was repelled, but the warriors quickly rallied and launched another attack. During this second charge, George Duncan shot and severely wounded a warrior who was charging forward. The warrior's fall seemed to halt the entire attacking force almost immediately. "I think I got one of their chiefs," Duncan called out as the attackers withdrew. The attacking warriors retreated, dragging their wounded comrade away and disappearing again behind the hills. The defenders speculated that perhaps the wounded warrior was a medicine man or chief, and they hoped this would be the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho's final attack. Their ammunition was beginning to run low, and the lack of reinforcements again began to diminish their hopes of escape. However, unwilling to risk relying on the native warriors having permanently withdrawn, civilian Colvin led an effort to reinforce the southern wall of the Hayfield Fort. "They'll come from the creek next," he predicted. "We need to strengthen this side before they return." The defenders soon spotted a formidable crowd of native warriors approaching, themselves exhausted, angry, and fearful. This time, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho attacked on foot, rushing quickly from the south toward the newly reinforced wall. A call rang out among the soldiers defending the Hayfield Fort: "Remain silent until the attacking force crossed the river and completely cleared the brush," entering the open ground between the river and the southern wall of the fort. Finally, civilian Colvin fired first, immediately followed by the remaining defenders, who continued to fire, reload, and fire repeatedly. Their discipline paid off as the warriors fell back under the withering fire. Once again, the men in the fort believed a chief had been killed in one of the volleys, with many other warriors falling, most either dead or severely wounded. The desperate attack was quickly repelled, and seeing a weakness in the now diminished Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces, Private Bradley volunteered to ride one of the 3 mules that had survived the battle to make a dash to Fort C.F. Smith to plead for reinforcements. "I can make it," Bradley insisted when others questioned the plan. "They're scattered now. This might be our only chance." With several warriors pursuing him the entire way, Private Bradley miraculously reached Fort C.F. Smith, his pursuers just dozens of yards behind him as he galloped through the fort's gates. The defenders at the Hayfield could only hope help would arrive before the warriors regrouped for another assault. Reinforcements arrive as daylight fades. When Private Bradley reached Fort C.F. Smith, he learned that Captain Burrows had already led Company G to provide relief. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Captain Fenton was ordered to lead Company H with a small howitzer cannon to bolster the relief force. The military command recognized that standard rifles alone might not be sufficient to break the siege. Artillery would provide the decisive advantage needed. The reinforcements reached the Hayfield as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon. They encountered scattered resistance from native warriors along the way, exchanging fire but maintaining their forward momentum. The arrival of fresh troops fundamentally altered the tactical situation, as the warriors now faced a numerically stronger and unwearied enemy. The officers assessed the casualty situation grimly. Lieutenant Sternberg lay dead, along with Private Nairn and civilian contractor J.G. Hollister. Several others nursed wounds of varying severity. The immediate evacuation to Fort C.F. Smith before nightfall became urgent not merely for medical care, but because the native forces would have a significant advantage in night fighting conditions. Only 3 mules remained out of 22, barely enough to pull 2 wagons for the dead and wounded. This loss of transportation represented a strategic vulnerability that could have proven fatal had the siege continued another day. Lieutenant Colonel Luther P. Bradley, who had arrived with the reinforcements, ordered the howitzer brought forward. Several powerful shots from the cannon sent native warriors scattering from their positions. The psychological impact of artillery was as significant as its physical effect. The thunderous explosions demonstrated firepower the warriors had not yet encountered in their campaigns. While rifles could be understood as more efficient versions of familiar weapons, artillery represented an entirely different category of threat. The retreating force moved cautiously, dealing with sporadic sniper fire from hidden warriors. The column maintained tight formation, with soldiers positioned to protect the wagons carrying their fallen comrades. The howitzer was used once more to fire at warriors gathering on a distant hill, the explosive shell dispersing them effectively. By approximately 8:30 that evening, the relief force and the Hayfield defenders had returned safely to Fort C.F. Smith. As they passed through the gates, exhausted men collapsed where they stood, many having fought for over 12 hours in the scorching summer heat. 3 Americans had died: Lieutenant Sternberg, Private Nairn, and J.G. Hollister, while several others suffered wounds. The fort's doctor worked through the night, tending to the injured, extracting bullets and binding wounds. The following day, another major battle, known as the Wagon Box Fight, took place near Fort Phil Kearny. In a remarkably similar scenario, a small detachment of soldiers armed with new breech-loading rifles held off a much larger force of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. The Hayfield Fight represents a pivotal moment in Plains warfare history, where technological advantage overcame numerical superiority. The battle demonstrated how the introduction of breech-loading rifles fundamentally changed combat dynamics, giving small groups of soldiers firepower that could effectively counter the traditional mass attack tactics of native forces. For military historians, the engagement offers a clear example of how technological innovation can rapidly shift tactical realities. The warrior's strategy, absorbing initial casualties before overwhelming defenders, had proven effective against muzzle loaders that required 30-40 seconds to reload. Against weapons that could fire 15-20 rounds per minute, this approach became catastrophically costly. The battle also illustrates the importance of adaptive leadership under pressure. When Lieutenant Sternberg fell, civilian Colvin stepped forward to organize the defense, an unusual instance of effective civilian command in a military crisis. His practical approach to maintaining cover likely saved numerous lives. Red Cloud's War would ultimately conclude with the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, one of the few instances where Native American resistance successfully forced the United States government to abandon territorial ambitions. The Hayfield Fight and similar engagements demonstrated to both sides that the nature of warfare on the plains was changing dramatically. Uncover more extraordinary stories from American history with histories and native tales. Subscribe now for weekly explorations of forgotten battles and the complex truth behind historical myths.